All right, time for the second of our lectures regarding the ethics of natural rights, although we're going to focus more specifically this time on feminist ethics. Not so much on the theory, but more on the practice, on the applied ethics. So, what topic will we be looking at? We will be considering the topic of abortion. And we're going to look at both sides of this topic. We're going to look first on what we might call the pro-life side, and then we're going to look next time on the pro-choice side. I'm going to try to be as fair and balanced as I can with both of them, and I'm going to give you the best arguments of which I am familiar from both sides, and I will leave it to you to determine which side you think makes the stronger case. All right, and just a reminder, you all remember oh, good grief. I almost called him Karl Marx. I'm sorry. You remember Groucho Marx here, his I'm Against It video. This is a topic that can easily stir up intense passions and feelings, which is all right. That's not a problem. But just remember, if you decide to write on this, make sure that your passions and your feelings are not the only thing you have. I can't really grade someone's passion. I need to be able to grade their reasons. So make sure you back them up with reasons. We're going to be talking specifically about abortion for convenience. And what we mean by abortion for convenience is when we're talking about a normal, healthy pregnancy in which the mother desires not to remain or to conclude the pregnancy. When I say conclude, not to give birth. So when we talk about a normal, healthy pregnancy, just so you understand, we're not talking about a developing embryo with severe deformities. We're not talking about severe health problems. We're not talking about the life of the mother being at risk. When we talk about a normal, healthy pregnancy, we're not talking about, for example, a rape case, pregnancy resulting from rape or incest or anything like that. We're talking about your typical, regularly expected, normal, healthy pregnancies. And the reasons that we're bracketing these in that sense is because when it comes to the pro-life side, there are quite a few of those who will say for exceptional cases where it's not merely for convenience, such as it were a rape case or something like that, they might say, then we can have exceptions like that. We can have exceptions for the life of the mother, for all those types of things. But when it comes to what are easily more than 80% of all the abortions in the West, we're talking about abortion for convenience, where there were not mitigating circumstances, no one's health was at risk, the mother simply did not wish to deliver. So these are the ones that we're specifically talking about. And for today, we're going to look at what is often called the SLED, S-L-E-D argument against the moral permissibility of abortion. You'll see why it's given that acronym in a moment. And we probably won't get to it today, but we'll close out when we look at the pro-choice side what is probably the best known argument for the moral permissibility of not just abortion, but abortion for convenience. It's called the famous violinist defense of abortion. So what does SLED stand for? Well, we'll get to that in a second, but the SLED argument is built on a basic understanding. Let's go ahead and see what that one is. We'll call this the setup argument for SLED. It's not the SLED argument itself. You'll know when you see that because these letters will all stand for a word. But this is basically what the SLED argument is going to presume. Number one, it's going to say it is morally wrong to kill a human for convenience. And again, we're not talking about self-defense. We're not talking about to save many other lives. We're talking about mere convenience. What would an example of this be? Suppose I'm waiting in line to get something, and I've got a bunch of people in front of me, and I don't want to wait very long, so I could kill a bunch of them and move a lot closer up in line. That would be an example of killing a human merely for my own convenience. Premise number two reads that an unborn human fetus is a living human. Now, obviously, there are going to be quite a number of people that are going to object and to challenge that claim. That's fine. We will take a look at that. But to finish getting the entire argument in place, let's go to the conclusion. And it says if everything above the line turns out to be correct, then the conclusion must be it is morally wrong to kill an unborn human fetus for convenience. Now, as we've seen many times, when you have a valid logical argument such as this, and valid just means supposing that all the statements above the line are true, that would guarantee that the conclusion also must be true. So this is a valid argument. It's set up where the truth of the premises would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. The only question is, are both premises above the line true? And if you don't like the conclusion, if you think it's wrong, then you have to pick a fight with one of the premises above the line. And clearly, the one that the SLED folks are expecting to get challenged on is number 2. It is possible you could challenge the first premise. You could say, I don't see anything wrong with killing humans for convenience. What's wrong with that? If you want to do that, you can. They do not expect that you're going to get very many points on your side. They don't expect many people are going to take you very seriously if you do that. They're basically not worried about defending that one. They think it is self-evidently true. However, number 2 is going to get quite a bit of resistance. So, obviously, the challenge is, why should we believe that the unborn human fetus is a living human being? Do you have any reasons for that, or are you just giving your opinion? And the SLED folks are going to say, that is a good challenge. We need to rise to meet that challenge. We can't just say, that's how we feel about it. We have to be able to give justifying reasons. So what are those reasons? And now we get in to the SLED of the argument. Basically, the SLED folks are going to say, if you deny number 2, if you say, no, the unborn human fetus is not a living human, then what you need to do is you need to be able to provide a significant difference between the unborn and the born. Clearly, the born are living human beings. If you want to say the unborn are not, you need to show why not. And the biggest differences between the born and the unborn are going to be these 4 things, according to the SLED folks. Obviously, there's going to be a tremendous difference in size. The unborn could be smaller than any living person, or I should say that's kind of using leading language there. They can be smaller than any born person could ever be, say the size of a thumb or something like that. There is a notable difference in size. There's also a notable difference in the level of development. What kind of development? Well, physical development for one. After all, at certain points, the unborn are growing lungs, are developing a heart. The brain is continually under development. Physical development would be one of those ways. Another one would be mental development. The unborn are not going to win too many IQ competitions. Number 3, environment. The unborn are physically located inside of another human being. This cannot be said about anyone regarding the born. And the last one, the last major difference, as the SLED folks see it, is the level of dependence. Obviously, the unborn depend upon others, namely the mother, for their very life. They cannot breathe on their own. Oxygen must be supplied through the umbilical cord. So the SLED folks will admit these are 4 major differences between those who are born and those who have yet to be born, the unborn. However, they will also conclude that while each of these differences is significant, none of them are moral differences. None of these differences actually disqualify the unborn from being living human beings. Now, there are at least 2 ways to try to counter this. One is to pick any one of these 4 differences, dig in your heels and say, yes, this does disqualify the unborn. This is a morally significant difference, and explain why it is. Don't let them push you off of it. The other possibility, and this takes a bit more creativity perhaps, is to think of a 5th difference that doesn't somehow already reduce down to some combination of these. So you may think about that if you want. You may say, do they really have all the major differences, the major distinctions up here, or is there something else they missed? Because if there is, you can sit back and relax. You can recline in your hammock, drink your pina colada, let them just kick all of these out of the way. And when they're done, you can say, that's nice, but you missed a fifth one that you didn't even talk about. So you haven't ruled out all the possible differences. So obviously I can't ask you in this particular setting whether or not you think there's a fifth difference that they're missing, but you might just think about that a little bit and say, all right, so is there another difference? Has nothing to do with the size, the development, either physically or mentally, the location, being physically inside a human being, the dependence, even for their very life. Is there anything else that is a significant difference that doesn't reduce to some combination of those four? And just remember, if someone is talking about, say, the financial situation, or if someone is talking about the health of the mother or something like that, just remember again, we're talking about abortion for convenience. We're talking about terminating a normal, healthy pregnancy because the mother desires not to remain pregnant. Well, if you have any thoughts, you can use those if you so desire in the upcoming exam. But for right now, let's presume that they've pretty much got it. Let's see if any of these four differences make a morally significant difference. So what about the physical size, the stature of the unborn? Like we said, this is clearly a tremendous distinction, but the SLED folks say it doesn't make a moral difference. They're going to say if one's size determines one's moral value, then yes, that's going to rule out the unborn, but it's not going to rule out only the unborn. It's also going to rule out others as well. And this is going to be a tactic that the SLED folks use over and over again. Sometimes it's called casting a broad net tactic, which basically says if you use this criteria to rule someone out, it will rule out the ones you intend to, but it will also rule out probably several others that you did not intend to. So the basic idea is if you want to make size, you must be at least this tall, you must be at least this big, you must reach this minimal size to be considered a human being. Then that will affect the unborn, but it will also affect, for example, pygmies. Do you guys know who pygmies are? Pygmies are a tribe in the jungles of Congo, Africa, where people will typically not reach 5 feet tall. So here's an example of a researcher. This woman here, I believe, is about 5'6", 5'7", somewhere around there. And at first glance, you may think that these are children. No, these are full-grown adult pygmies. The ground is actually slanted a little bit, so it looks like some of them get a little taller, and maybe some of them are, but most of these never reach 5 feet tall. That's just their typical full-grown status. Here's another picture of a 5'10", 5'11", researcher, and most pygmies will wear modern clothing, as you can kind of see in the back, but these ones here are wearing their traditional tribal apparel for the picture, kind of showing what they would culturally look like before there was a lot of contact. Again, they're just not very tall. They don't get very big. So if one wants to say that one's physical size, one's physical status affects one's moral value, then one would have to say that pygmies are just worth less than your typical taller human being. You'd have to say that the taller you are, the more valuable you are. The shorter, the smaller you are, the less you count. Yet these are clearly 100% human beings. They just happen to be short. The fact that they're short, most people would say, does not in any way give rise to the answer that they don't count morally, that their suffering, that their interests don't matter. And it wouldn't just be pygmies. Pygmies are perhaps the most intriguing example, but this would also include generally children. Children are small. Young children are smaller than pygmies. Does that mean they count the least? Does that mean that when it comes to who we should save and who we need to sacrifice, children need to go on the chopping block first? Most people would say no, children should be the first ones to be saved. Well, you can say that if you want, but if you do, you don't really believe that one's size has any influence on one's moral value. Someone might say, well, the difference with children is if you leave them alone and give them what they need, eventually they'll grow. Well, that's true. That's also true of the unborn. If you let them reach their potential, they'll grow to be a typical size just like almost everyone else. And then this may be the most unusual of the examples, but nevertheless, it's the case. If one really wants to say your physical size, your physical stature, determine your moral value and your worth as a being, then while there are plenty of exceptions, in general, women are smaller than men. Women tend to be shorter than men. Women tend to weigh less than men. They tend to be smaller. Does that mean they count less? And if you're saying, no, I don't think so, I don't think that matters, then the SLED folks are saying, good, we agree. We agree that women and children should not be the ones that are sacrificed first. We agree that pygmies are not lesser humans just because they tend to be shorter. Why not just agree with us on all of those, and that the unborn are not any less human just because they happen to be smaller? But if you want to say size makes the difference, it's going to affect a lot more than just the unborn. So that's size. That's one's physical stature. What about environment? Now you might be saying, wait a second here, didn't we miss something? I mean, if we go back and we look at here it is, if we look at the SLED argument, the first one is size. Isn't the next one supposed to be level of development? That would be the next one if we were going in order. I'm actually going to save that one for last, because this is the most controversial. This is where all the action is. So we're going to skip that one for now, go down to environment, conclude with dependence, or I shouldn't say conclude, but move on to dependence, and then we'll look at level of development last, because that's where most of the controversy is. So with that being the case, let's go ahead and move down to environment. Like we said, a strong difference between the born and the unborn. The unborn, their environment literally is a human being, namely the mother. So here's what the SLED folks are going to say. They're going to say, yes, this is a difference. This is a strong difference, but is it a morally significant difference? Does this affect the one's status as a human being? They're going to say no. Why not? Because they're going to say where you are, your location, has absolutely no bearing on what, or perhaps on who you are. Your location does not determine your essence. Your location does not determine your species. That is independent of your location and your environment. So, for example, you guys know what a joey is, right? A joey is a very young kangaroo. Does a joey cease to be a kangaroo? You know, when it's out in the plains and the outback, it's hopping around and playing with other joeys, but all of a sudden it comes back to its mother, leaps inside the mother's marsupial pouch. Does it cease to be a joey at that point? When its head is, like in this picture, is sticking out of the pouch, do you go, ugh, what is it now? No, of course it's still a kangaroo. Of course it's still a young and a developing kangaroo. Whether it's inside the pouch or outside of the pouch, that makes no difference. That has no bearing on what the joey is. It doesn't change it. Now they're going to ask, why should location make any difference when talking about the unborn? Well, I squeezed a little bit ahead of the example here, but I might as well go ahead and give what it is. I thought this picture was coming later. You might say, when going back and looking at the picture of the kangaroo and the joey in the pouch, you might say, okay, yes, I see. That makes plenty of sense for kangaroos and for their young, which go in the pouch and come out the pouch and all that stuff. But what does that have to do with humans? What does that have to do with the unborn in terms of humanity? The difference in this case is, you might say, once someone is born, they never go back inside. and the unborn never leave and come back. That's just not applicable. Well, that would make a lot of sense, but there are some relatively unusual counterexamples of that. One of them is the case of Sarah Switzer. Sarah Switzer was developing, she was not yet born, and she had a case of, and I always seem to mispronounce this. You guys may need to correct me in the comments a little bit. I believe it's pronounced spinal bifida, something like that. It's a condition that is actually fairly easy to fix. It is treatable, but you need to get to it within a certain amount of time. And very often, by the time that the unborn are delivered, it's been too late and there's going to be severe damage, could result in paralysis, other issues like that, very frequently results in death. Well, in 1999, there was a family, the Switzers, who found out that their unborn had this condition. And the doctor said, now, we have been considering a special type of treatment for quite a while now. We've been doing all the research. We've been doing tests. By the way, a lot of these tests were medical experiments on animals, kind of hearkening back to our previous topic. And they said everything makes it look like it should work, but we've never actually done it before. What we want to do is we want to operate on the mother, Mrs. Switzer. We want to surgically remove her uterus, open it up, remove the developing embryo, treat the condition now before it's too late, reimplant the embryo into the uterus, and then reimplant the uterus back into the mother to allow it to grow and develop further. It's really a bit too early to deliver the unborn. They said, we can't guarantee it. We don't know for sure it'll work, but we're willing to try if you are. And the Switzer said, yes, we want to try this. So the operation, and this is a photograph from that, it took place exactly as described. They literally removed the mother's womb, opened it, treated young Sarah, and then placed her back inside. This is actually what's going on. This picture almost looks like young Sarah's reaching out and grabbing the finger of the doctor, but both mother and daughter were anesthetized during this procedure. They were unconscious. This is actually just the very young small arm being placed back inside of the uterus. But if someone is going to say environment makes all the difference, location is the defining characteristic, then they would have to say that at this particular point, when Sarah's environment is no longer physically inside her mother, she has become a living human being. So again, just to go over that, they would have to say that she was a living human being at this point, but then once she was reimplanted back inside her mother, she would have lost her human status. But the sled folks are going to say, how can that be? If she's a human now, she's a human when she's put back in. If she's a human now, she was a human before. Nothing about her has changed. Changing location, changing environment doesn't change what or who you are. So not to be unpleasant here, but the sled folks are going to say, if you really think that environment makes the difference, you've got some explaining to. You have got to explain how traveling approximately 8 inches down the birth canal can somehow suddenly turn a non-human into a full-fledged human being. How does that happen? What is the difference in the essence of the person? And they're going to say, clearly there is no difference. That's why environment, why there is a major distinction between the born and the unborn, does not make a morally significant difference on what, or really they'd say on who, the person is. So that's 2 of the 4. We've looked at size. We've looked at environment. In both cases, the sled folks say, I think we have good reason to say they do not disqualify the unborn from being humans. Let's go ahead and look at the D for dependence. Now, again, unquestionably, the unborn cannot even breathe without depending on the oxygen that the mother supplies to him through the umbilical cord. But we're going to see the same type of tactic we've seen before. The SLED folks are going to say, all right, if we want to make dependence the key feature, if you want to say that those who depend on others, not just for their well-being, but for their very life, do not qualify as living humans, then that will disqualify the unborn, but it's also going to knock a few other people out of human status as well, including the severely disabled. I think I might have a picture here. I guess it'll be coming up after I finish this list. It will include the severely disabled. It may well include quite a few elderly people, and somewhat surprisingly, although not really if you think about it, it will also throw out newborns. Newborns are not particularly able to take care of themselves. I mean, you can't give birth and then 30 minutes later put the newborn out on the street corner, put $5 in his diaper and say, okay, the bus comes by in 5 minutes, have a good rest of your life. You can't do that. They can't even sit up on their own. They are entirely dependent on others to be fed, to be clothed, to be warmed, to be comforted. I mean, they need physical touch. They need people to exist. Does that mean that newborns aren't really humans? Does that mean that they can be terminated for convenience? Almost everyone would say no, so the SLED folks say, okay, if not them, then what makes the unborn any different? So here's the picture. Do you guys know who this is supposed to be? This actor who portrayed Superman back in the 1980s? Any of you say, oh, that's Christopher Reeves. That's right. Did you hear what tragically happened to him after he had made a couple of the Superman movies? He had a very severe accident. I believe he was riding a horse, and I don't know if he fell off or if he got thrown against a fence or exactly what it was, but he severely broke his back, and he became a quadriplegic. Could not move any of his limbs. Not only that, he literally could not breathe on his own. He had to have an apparatus that helped him breathe, and if they turned it off, within about 12 or 13 minutes, he would start to labor so much he would not be able to supply adequate oxygen to his body. He could not breathe without assistance. He depended on his very life. He depended on others for his very life. Now that's a pretty severe level of dependence. I can't breathe unless someone makes it possible for me to do that. Does that mean that Christopher Reeves lost his status as a living human being? Well, if you're going to say it all comes down to being independent, not needing to depend on anyone else for your livelihood, we'd have to say he lost that status. But of course, many people would say, no, of course he's still a human being. He's just now depends on other people to keep him alive, keep him going. Well, that may be, but then the SLED folks are going to say, why not say the same thing about the unborn? In fact, you could say of the unborn, if you give them enough time, they will almost certainly reach the potential where they will become independent. Sadly, Christopher Reeves never became independent again. He always depended on the care of others. So that's why they're going to say if you're going to make dependence or the ability to live independently, independent viability, your standard of what qualifies human from non-human, you're going to lose quite a few more than just the unborn. All right. This is the one everyone's been waiting for. Level of development, both physical and mental. So, we'll start off with what the SLED folks say, and it's probably exactly what you imagined it would be. They're going to use the exact same tactic they've been using before, the casting a broad net strategy. All right, guys, you want to say that if someone lacks mental or physical development, then they fail to qualify as living humans? Then guess what? That's also going to catch, as we've already seen, the severely disabled. Pretty sure I have an example here. Oh yeah, I do remember Mary and Jody, the conjoined twins. Remember, Mary, or I guess I could say first, Jody actually had a functioning heart and lungs. Mary did not. But as they were conjoined, Jody's heart and lungs supplied oxygen and circulation to Mary. She kept her alive. However, if you're going to say that you have to have a certain threshold of physical development, like a beating human heart, or whatever else it may be, then you'd have to say that Mary, who was aware and conscious of her environment, who was nursing, who was crying, who was interacting just as much as Jody, you'd have to say Mary did not meet that threshold. She did not qualify as a living human. And therefore, her life would have no protection. That's an example of the disabled, specifically the physically disabled. We could also talk about the severely mentally disabled. Do you remember Tracy Latimer? Tracy Latimer, who had that tremendously severe cerebral palsy. At 12 years old, they said that she had the mentality of a 6-month-old infant and that she had plateaued, and that if she lived another 20 years, she would not develop any further. Yet quite a few of you were outraged when you heard what her dad did in terms of taking her out to his truck, connecting a hose to the exhaust pipe, and fumigating her to death. Now, if you have to reach a certain level of mental development, then we'd have to say, I don't know what people are upset about. No human died during this process. But if you think she did, then you better be careful about saying you have to be so smart, you have to have so much cognitive ability. Baby Teresa. What is the term? Anencephalic? I don't remember exactly how it goes. Basic, almost born without a brain. You can literally see the brainstem coming up through the top of the skull which doesn't even totally form. No outside senses, no sight, no touch, no taste, no smell, no hearing, no window to the outside world. Does that mean she's not human? Well, if your instinct is to say, no, this is still a living human being for any one of these, then they're going to say you better be careful when you talk about levels of development. It's not just going to be the severely disabled. This would also include those who are in comas. Now, there are different types of comas. There are, for example, medical-induced comas, in which someone is very likely to come out of in a reasonable amount of time. And I can't remember what the others are called. I just think of them as deep comas. They may never come out. And there is no real sign of internal mental life. Now, I'm not saying there isn't. I can't possibly know. But there just doesn't seem to be any sign of mental life, of mental activity. And quite a few of those who come out of the comas say it's not like anything. There's no sense of time. There's no sense of duration. I don't get bored. I wasn't thinking about things. It's just like I blinked. Well, if that's the case, then this is an astonishing lack of mental ability. Does that mean that the comatose are no longer human beings? Does that mean that they could be removed from the living for matters of convenience? After all, it costs money to keep them alive. And imagine that someone was in a deep coma for, say, 9 months, and then they would reliably come out of it and start being able to develop normally again. Would we say as long as you get to them before they come out of the coma, then it doesn't count? No humans have been killed in this process? And then the last example, not only the severely disabled, not only the comatose, but also newborns. Here's a picture of a very prematurely born newborn. I want to say this is somewhere between the 6th and 7th month of development. Very, very small. Almost, the strong preference is that when they're this young, this small, they're still developing within the mother. Sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes they need to be induced early. Sometimes birth takes place before anyone is ready for it to. But if someone would look at this very premature newborn right now and say, yes, it's a human being, then what difference would it make if this human being were still receiving nutrition and development from within the mother? So for all these reasons, all these examples, they say, if you want to draw the line at the level of development, either physical development or mental development, you're going to be drawing that line around a lot more than just the unborn. You're going to be relegating quite a few that you probably didn't intend to being outside living human beings. Now, with all that being said, some of you may have already had an objection waiting to come out. And this is an objection that needs to be considered. Say, okay, hold on a second, sled folks. You've been showing us, pictures of newborns and even that interesting, if not disturbing, picture of young Sarah Switzer who was operated on, then reimplanted within her mother. And all these examples, you're showing little tiny, what clearly look like human bodies with arms and legs and fingers and recognizable features like that. But what if we go back a lot earlier? What if we're talking about the very earliest stages of development? What if we're talking about a fetus or a zygote or something that doesn't have legs, something that doesn't have a head, no discernible heart or brain? Are you going to tell me that that's human? I don't think so. I think it's just a clump of cells. Here, look at this. This is a very interesting picture. This shows the fertilized egg on the very first day. It just looks like a sphere. Now, on the second day in the morning, you can see it's almost doubled its size, how quickly and rapidly that it multiplies the cells. This is day 2 in the afternoon. It is quickly and obviously growing. Day 6. But here's the thing. Stand back and look at it. Does anyone look at these rapidly multiplying cells and say, oh yeah, looks like a human to me. Reminds me of my Uncle Matt. Does anyone think that? I don't think so. If I just showed you these pictures and said it was nascent life developing, you wouldn't know if it was a human or a tadpole. You would have no idea what it is. So, what about this objection that says, yeah, when it looks like a human, all right, maybe you've got a point there, but what about this? What about just this cluster of flesh? Can you even call it flesh? This clump of cells. Clearly not a human yet. Now, give it enough time and it'll start to develop into one, but it's not yet. And if this simple clump of cells is removed, can you really say that a human life has been destroyed? I think this is an important objection. It's one that the sled folks need to confront. So what do you think? Do we really have a living human being here, or is this something that is not yet human? So what are the sled folks going to say? Come on, guys, isn't it just a clump of cells? Well, it may surprise you that quite a few sled folks will say, sure, yeah, of course you're right, I agree with that. However, I don't exactly see what the problem is, because aren't we all just a clump of cells? I mean, isn't that the definition of a living organism? It's based upon a whole bunch of cells. We're all just a clump of cells. Some of us are just clumpier than others. If you zoom in real close on any human being, we're going to look kind of like this. So perhaps the real issue here is not so much made of a bunch of cells. That's just life. That's just biology. Maybe the real issue here is it doesn't, stand back and look at it. It doesn't strike me as human. It doesn't resemble humans like I've seen before. To which the sled folks are going to say, I understand. I agree. When I see those early stages of development, it doesn't obviously look human to me either. But I think they're going to say, this depends on the false idea that you have to look human to be human. Let me show you a quick example. What do you think this is? It's not a human embryo. It's not a salamander. I might think it's some sort of a salamander. This is a newborn kangaroo. This is an infant joey. Now, did it look like one? Does that look? Do you look at that and say, "Oh, clearly that's a kangaroo"? Well, if you do, congratulations. I would never have seen it. It looks nothing like a kangaroo to me. Again, I would have thought it was a salamander of some sort. Nevertheless, it was a kangaroo. How do you know it's a kangaroo? Do a genetic test. It has kangaroo DNA. If you're still not sure, leave it alone. Watch what it becomes. Only kangaroos grow into kangaroos. Nothing else does. Salamanders never become kangaroos. Now, if you go back and if you were to take a sample of the genetic code of the DNA of that mere clump of cells, guess what you would find? You would find human DNA. And again, if you left it alone, it would grow and develop into a normal functioning human. Nothing else does that. Here's another interesting photograph. This was of someone in China who had what is colloquially known as elephant man's disease. Basically, that just means some of the cells in his body are just madly producing tumors and never stop. And you see all sorts of just massive tumors on the face and other parts of the body. He's already got one eye that he can't open anymore because it's just covered up entirely. It's very difficult for him to feed himself. Now, there are parts of him, like you can see the hand here, that looks more like a typical human hand. You can see the right arm here. That looks like a human being. But if there were enough time, and he'd never lived this long, this would kill him long before it, you can already see there are tumors spreading to other parts of his body. If he were able to be somehow kept alive long enough, his entire body would eventually become this undifferentiated mass of flesh. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to be unkind. I'm not making fun of this poor individual. But if I were walking down through a dark alley at night and I came face to face with him, my first thought would not be, oh, what a poor, deformed human being. My first thought would literally be, I've met Jabba the Hutt. He does not look human. Nevertheless, he is. And there aren't many pictures because this man didn't want all the attention. But like I said, he was in China. The Chinese government decided to give him a free surgery to remove the tumors. He was impoverished. He wasn't able to afford it. They removed it. He was still deformed, but at least it wasn't so grotesque. Unfortunately, those tumors are growing back, some of them faster than before. Does that mean that he's not a human being? Does someone who's been badly burned lose their status within humanity because they don't look human? And the sled folks are going to say, no, look, just because we expect people to look human, that's not what makes them human. But even so, still, look at this. I realize it may be a bit bigger, a few more cells than the ones we saw in the last picture, but does that really just scream humanity when you see it? Well, the sled folks are going to say, I hope so, because what you are now looking at are 100% normal adult cells. We all kind of look like that when you zoom in that close. And there's really not much difference between what you see here in the adult cells and what we saw before with the early fetal development. The difference in color, this one being green, the last one being blue, that's not really the color of the cells. They're pretty much the same. The difference in color comes from the microscope projecting color on them to make it easier to see the differences between them. So, as we kind of draw this section to a close, and like I said, we'll come back and we'll look at the other side next time, the SLED folks are going to say, we've looked at all 4 factors. We've looked at size. We've looked at level of development. We've considered environment. We've taken a close look at the level of dependence. And these are all major differences. They make a difference, but they don't make a moral difference according to the SLED argument. None of them distinguish the unborn from the born. None of them disqualify the unborn as being living human beings. But if you disagree, and they're going to say, I guess you can, we can't stop you, you're going to have to throw a lot more people out of humanity than just the unborn. Now, one last thing I want to look at before we close is the topic or the question of the burden of proof. Now, someone on the pro-choice side might say, well, you've brought up some interesting examples. You've shown some curious reasoning here, but I think you failed to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that the unborn are clearly living human beings. I mean, maybe it's a closer call than I originally thought, but have you really proven it? Is it certain? Now, this question of the burden of proof is an interesting question because both sides will claim that the other side bears the burden of proof. You know how this works legally, don't you? If I'm accused of murder and I'm taken to trial, who has the burden of proof? Do I have to prove that I'm not guilty, or does the prosecution have to prove that I am guilty of murder? We don't both have the burden of proof. Only one side does. Which is it? It's the prosecution. They have to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that I'm guilty, that I committed the murder. My lawyer doesn't have to prove that I'm innocent. All he has to do is raise suspicion that I might be innocent. Doesn't have to prove that I am. It's the other side bears the burden of proof. Now, in this case, which side should bear the burden of proof? Should it be the pro-life side or should it be the pro-choice side? Should they share it? And I'm not exactly sure. Both sides will claim the other one bears the burden of proof. This is what some people call burden of proof volleyball, where one side says, no, you've got to prove it, and they knock it over there, and the other side says, no, you've got to prove it, and they try to knock it back. And I'm not sure that that really solves anything, but I'll just close with this because, frankly, I find it interesting. This last argument that the SLED folks, the pro-life folks, say, this is why it makes more sense to say that those who favor the permissibility of abortion actually bear the burden of proof. They're going to claim that the abortion advocate does bear this burden, namely to prove that no living human beings are being destroyed. Now, why would they say that? Because they're going to say in difficult cases, in cases where it might be too close to call, doesn't it make more sense to err on the side of protecting life rather than to err on the side of destroying life? In other words, they're saying, this might be a close call. We may not have absolute certainty whether or not this is a human life or not, or whether or not a human life is being threatened. So what is better? To make absolutely sure we are not possibly destroying human life, or to err on the side of possibly destroying human life? Which one makes more sense? Let me explain by the use of this example. Suppose that this is an old abandoned building, this skyscraper, and it's been sitting there for years, unused, unproductive. And suppose I tell you that I've gone out and I have purchased this building. And you say, what are you going to do with that old thing? It's in such bad repair, it's going to take a fortune to make it usable again. And I say, that's right. That's why I'm not going to fix it. I'm going to demolish it. I'm going to blow it up, destroy it, and then I'm just going to use the space to, build a parking lot for limousines or something and make a bunch of money. And you might say, well, okay, I guess you can do that if you want to, but Ilford, a lot of times these old abandoned buildings, especially ones that have been sitting there as long as this one has, sometimes homeless people start to go and stay there and start sleeping there at nights and make that their residence. And I'm just wondering, have you made absolutely sure that this is empty before you demolish it? Have you made sure that there's no one staying there, that no kids play there? Have you been diligent to guarantee that no human life is destroyed before you hit the detonator? And suppose I say, well, no, I haven't exactly gone through and checked, but I don't think there are any living human beings in there. I'm pretty sure. I hope not. And imagine you say, well, don't you need to be sure? And suppose I say, no, I don't think I have to be sure. I shouldn't have to prove that there's no one in there. In fact, I think that the burden of proof lies on the other side. Someone has to prove to me that there are living human beings in there, or else I'm free to demolish it. And suppose you say, but wait a second, that doesn't make... Oh, too late. There it goes. Whoo. Did that make sense? Well, in the same way, see here this unborn fetus. This is somewhere between 6 and 7 weeks of development. Different people will look at this and they'll come to different conclusions. There are some people that will say that is clearly a young, growing human being. It's not even close. There are certainly others who will look and say it's clearly not. It's something else. Maybe it'll grow into a human one day, but it's not yet. And there are others that say, I just don't know. It's too hard to tell. It's too close a call. And by the way, my understanding, and it's different for different people, my understanding is that typically the mother will first realize she's pregnant somewhere between 4 and 7 weeks of development. So this is right in that time when the mother may realize that she's pregnant. Well, the SLED folks are going to say, if you're not absolutely sure, it is far, far better to err on the side of protecting life. They're going to say, here's the question you should ask, what if you're wrong? So the SLED folks will say, what if I'm wrong? What if there is no human life there that's being destroyed when an abortion for convenience takes place? What have we lost? Well, we have saddled perhaps the mother or the family with some inconvenience that they did not want to have, and that means something. That's not nothing. You don't want to do that to someone unnecessarily. But then they'll say, but what if the other side is wrong? Then they'd say, then the most innocent and helpless of human life has been snuffed out. Which side should we guard against the stronger? So based on all those reasonings, they're going to go back to the setup argument for the SLED case, and they're going to say, as we've already seen, as everyone already realizes, it is morally wrong to kill a human for convenience. We've just gone over the case for premise number 2, which says an unborn human fetus is a living human being. And again, if someone disagrees, that's fine. They're going to say, show us where we're wrong. Explain why that's not the case, and then tell us whether or not you're willing to allow others like the disabled, the elderly, the newborns, the infirm to be thrown out of the species as well. If you can't show where that goes wrong, then we are committed to the conclusion that it is morally wrong to kill an unborn human fetus for convenience. Now, just a very brief glimpse into our next lecture, which will look at the other side, the pro-choice side. We're going to look at someone who's going to take this argument and they're going to look at premise number 2 and say, do I really believe that the unborn human fetus is a living human being? I don't really, but you know what? I'm in such a good mood, I'm going to give that to you. I'm going to, for the sake of argument, grant that. I'm going to suppose that that really is true. And then the sled folks are going to rejoice. They're going to say, then we've won. That's the only questionable part of the argument. If you give us that to us, what else is there to attack? And they're going to say, how about this first premise? I'm going to argue that it is not true, that it is always morally wrong to kill a human for convenience. And you may say, that doesn't sound like a very promising tactic. It doesn't sound like a very promising tactic, but if nothing else, it's certainly bold. And quite a few students, when they hear it, they go, that's not as preposterous as I originally thought it would be. But we'll come back and we'll take a closer look at that next time.